The table ran nearly the full length of the Millhaven Grange yard, and still it was not long enough. Pumpkins, the color of harvest moons, sat at the far end, each one requiring 2 hands and a bent back to lift. Cabbages spread open like something from a seed catalog illustration. The kind of illustration that farmers generally dismissed as artistic exaggeration. Carrots had been laid in rows, and grown men stood beside them holding those carrots against their own forearms. And the carrots did not lose the comparison. Tomatoes, long finished by October's cool breath, but preserved whole in crocks of brine, gleamed through the glass when the wife set them on the table's edge, with the same unhurried care she gave to everything. The crowd pressed close, not rowdy, just stunned into a particular quality of silence that is different from ordinary quiet. It was the silence of people revising something they had believed with confidence. She stood a few steps back from the table, beside her husband, and she was not watching the vegetables. She was watching the faces. He was watching them too, though if you had asked either of them later, they might have said they were simply standing together in the October afternoon, letting the moment settle the way a dust cloud settles after a long wagon has passed, slowly, completely, until the air is clear again. 6 months ago, these same people had laughed, not unkindly, or perhaps not meaning to be unkind, which is sometimes a different thing and sometimes exactly the same. They had laughed from fence posts and from the seats of wagons paused along the road, from the doorway of Cord Fettle's feed store, from the comfortable position of people who had worked this ground for years and knew, in the particular way that experience teaches, what worked and what did not. They had watched a young couple from Cincinnati, polished boots, clean gloves, city coats that had no business in a Nebraska wind, purchase 40 baby chicks, and then, impossibly, release those chicks into open garden rows without a fence post between them and the world. They had given the seedlings maybe a week. She had given them until October. That difference between a week and October was not luck or accident or the mysterious kindness of a good season. It was a pamphlet in a worn leather satchel, and a father who had believed in writing things down, and a husband and wife who had decided, without anyone's permission or approval, to trust what they had read. It was 40 small yellow birds working rows of dark Nebraska soil in the pale morning light, while she watched from the cabin door, and then again in the softer evening, while he walked the beds with slow, deliberate attention. It was a method that looked like foolishness until it did not look like foolishness anymore. The table held the proof of it now, and the neighbors were crowding closer, and the October air smelled of turned earth and coming frost. She reached over and found his hand, and neither of them said a word. They did not need to. Not yet. The road back to April is not a long one, but it is a steep one. It goes backward through summer's green weight and spring's slow unfurling, past the first pale shoots pushing out of dark soil, all the way to a morning in early April, 1873, when the supply wagon from the Platte River Road groaned to a stop on Millhaven's main street, and 2 passengers stepped down onto Nebraska mud as though they were stepping onto a Cincinnati boulevard. He came first, offering his hand to help her down. Both of them wore city coats, his a deep charcoal wool, hers a fitted brown traveling dress with clean cuffs. Their boots were polished. Her gloves were pale leather, barely worn. He carried 2 large trunks, and a canvas-wrapped bundle of tools. She carried the worn leather satchel over one shoulder, tucked close against her side, as though she knew already it was the most valuable thing she owned. Millhaven in early April was still deciding what season it wanted to be. The main street ran 100 yards of packed dirt between a feed merchant, a dry goods store, a smithy, and a scattering of clapboard structures that leaned slightly into each other for warmth. The sky above was wide and colorless, and the wind came in long, flat gusts off the open country to the west, indifferent to newcomers. The people noticed them immediately. It would have been difficult not to. By the time they had arranged their trunks beside the wagon and inquired at the dry goods counter about the road east to their claimed lot, word had already moved down the street and doubled back. A Cincinnati couple, young, the Harwick plot. That last detail drew the longest pauses. The old Harwick ground sat on the eastern edge of the settlement, 160 acres of flat, pale prairie that had already disappointed one family before them. The soil ran thin over hardpan in several places. The creek that edged the property's southern border ran reliably enough in spring, but was known to shrink to a trickle by August. The previous claimant had left behind a weathered two-room clapboard cabin and a reputation for the land as something a sensible man would pass over, in favor of ground that rewarded effort more generously. None of this was news to the people of Millhaven. All of it appeared to be news to the couple standing in the street with their polished boots slowly acquiring Nebraska mud. The whispers did not take long to find a shape. A season, some said. Maybe less if summer came in hard. They were kind whispers mostly, the kind that do not wish a person ill, but simply account for what seems likely. The frontier kept its own arithmetic, and city clothes did not factor favorably into the calculation. She adjusted the satchel strap on her shoulder and looked east, toward the road they would take to the cabin. He stood beside her, reading the same horizon. Neither of them looked like people who had heard the whispers. Or perhaps they had heard them, and had simply already decided those whispers were someone else's concern. The cabin was smaller than it had looked from the road. That was her first thought when he pushed open the door and the smell of old wood and cold ash came forward to meet them. Not unpleasant exactly, but particular. The smell of a place that had been empty long enough to forget it was supposed to be a home. 2 rooms, a plank floor in the front, packed earth in the back, a cast iron stove with a cracked firebox collar that he noted without comment, running his thumb along the seam. A window with no glass, only a square of oiled cloth tacked at the corners and already beginning to yellow. A table, rough cut, with one leg shimmed by a folded piece of bark. She stood in the middle of the front room and turned slowly, the way a person does when they are not despairing but simply taking an honest inventory. Then she set her satchel on the table and the bark shim held. That evening, after he had coaxed a fire from the stove, and she had found that the back room caught the last of the western light at just the right angle, she opened the satchel. Not to inventory it. She knew every item inside as well as she knew her own hands, but because the opening of it had always been its own kind of comfort. The papers came out one by one. Her father's handwriting covered most of them, a precise and slanted script that had belonged entirely to him, unhurried even in its enthusiasm. Soil composition notes, sketches of raised bed arrangements, A careful record of companion plantings tested over 30 years in the Cincinnati garden, where she had grown up, walking the rows beside him, asking questions he always answered as though they deserved to be taken seriously. He sat across from her and watched her turn the pages. He had known her father. He understood what it meant that these papers had made the journey when other things had not. Near the bottom of the satchel was a pamphlet, thinner than the others, its cover worn soft as cloth. She placed it on the table between them and smoothed it flat with her palm. It described a practice she had read once, years before her father died, and which he had discussed with her at length over the course of a single long afternoon. The ranging of young chickens through garden beds during their earliest weeks, before the birds grew large enough to damage mature growth. The chicks ate the insects and their larvae from the soil. They scratched the surface lightly, loosening it without uprooting. They left behind what the pamphlet called natural enrichment, and what her father had simply called the most honest exchange in a garden. She had marked that afternoon in her memory, the way you mark something you do not yet know you will need. He read the pamphlet carefully, turned it over, read it again. When he looked up, she was already watching him. No argument passed between them, no declaration. Only the quiet, specific understanding of two people who have already decided to trust each other, and who understand, without saying so, that trust was exactly what her father had also left them. The lamp burned low, and the plains outside the cabin were entirely still. They began the next morning before the light had fully settled over the prairie. He walked the eastern field with a long measuring cord while she stood at the cabin door with her father's notes spread open against her forearm, reading the spacing requirements aloud in a clear, unhurried voice that carried easily across the flat ground. The soil was workable, damp from a light rain 2 nights before, and it gave way under the spade with a sound like a quiet agreement. He turned each row with care, the way a man works when he understands that what he is doing will matter later. She followed behind him and crumbled the larger clods by hand, working them fine between her palms until the bed lay soft and even. They planted 4 beds in sequence over 3 days. Cabbages first in the northernmost strip, the seeds pressed into shallow furrows with her thumb. At intervals she had measured exactly from her father's handwritten chart. Then pumpkins in the wide southern bed, given the most room, the seeds set in pairs. Then tomatoes along the western edge where the afternoon light would reach them longest. Then carrots in the remaining strip, raked fine and watered from the bucket they carried up from the creek in the cool hours of morning. The seeds were from Cincinnati, wrapped in folded paper inside a small tin box she had kept in the bottom of the leather satchel since the day they packed their wagon. Each paper was labeled in her father's hand. She did not mention this, but he noticed the way she set the empty papers aside rather than discarding them. On the 4th morning, he drove the wagon into Millhaven. Mr. Cord Fettle was sweeping his storefront step when the wagon came up the main road, and he stopped sweeping to watch it park. He had sold the couple their seed corn 2 weeks prior, and had thought little of them beyond the observation that they were clean-handed and polite and unlikely to last 2 seasons. The husband came inside, set both hands on the counter, and said he needed 40 baby chicks. The youngest Fettle had as close to newly hatched as could be managed. Fettle had them as it happened. A brooding hen had been productive. Then the husband explained the intended use. Fettle's eyebrows did not move at first. Then they rose, slowly and with great deliberateness, the way a man's eyebrows rise when he is choosing whether to say what he is thinking. He chose to say it. He asked, with genuine curiosity and only a small measure of amusement, whether the man understood that chickens ate plants. The husband said that he did, and that these would not be eating plants. They would be eating what was living beneath them. Fettle looked at him for a long moment. Then he wrote the sale into his ledger, accepted payment, and helped load the crate into the wagon bed without another word. By sundown, every family within 4 miles of Millhaven had heard some version of the story. Most of them were laughing. The chicks arrived home in a wooden crate that fit neatly behind the wagon seat, 40 of them tucked together in a living, trembling mass of yellow down. She had lined a shallow corner of the cabin with straw that first night, and the small creatures had settled into it with the unremarkable confidence of animals that do not yet know they are expected to survive a hard country. She was out before full light the next morning. He watched her from the cabin doorway, still holding his coffee, as she knelt at the edge of the nearest bed, the carrots barely showing their first thin green threads above the soil, and opened the low wooden gate she had fashioned from split lath and a single leather hinge. The chicks came through it, not in a rush, but in a slow, curious drift, each one tilting its head at the ground, with the studious attention of a scholar encountering a new text. She moved with them, unhurried, crouching low, using nothing more than the gentle flat of her hand to redirect any bird that wandered too near a seedling. She did not chase. She guided. There was a difference, and she understood it. By the time the sun cleared the tree line to the east, she had worked them through 2 full rows. The neighbors arrived not long after. They did not come all at once. That would have required admitting they were curious. Instead, they materialized separately along the fence lines in the manner of people who happened to be passing by and simply paused for reasons unrelated to anything particular. The Habit family's eldest son leaned against a post to the north, thumbs in his belt loops, watching without expression. 2 women from the Soren homestead stood together at the south corner, speaking quietly to each other in the way people speak when they are not actually talking about what they are looking at. Mr. Cord Fettle himself appeared on the road that ran along the eastern edge of the claim and stopped his wagon there for several minutes before clicking his tongue at his mule and moving on. Not one of them said a word to the couple. They only watched, and what they saw was, by any fair accounting, unremarkable. 40 small birds moved through the garden rows. They pecked at the soil. They scratched with the lightest of scratches, barely more than a dusting, the way wind moves surface dirt. They consumed things invisible to watching eyes. A larva here, a small cluster of eggs beneath a clod of earth, a beetle moving too slowly in the morning cool. The seedlings stood untouched. Not one stem bent. Not one pale green shoot disappeared. It proved nothing, the neighbors would have told each other. The seedlings were still slight and new. A chick could not do much damage to something that had barely emerged. Wait until the birds were larger. Wait until the plants were something worth destroying. The watching was not approval. It was not even doubt reconsidered. It was simply the particular silence of people who had expected a spectacle and had not yet received one. The wife gathered the birds in at mid-morning, counted them by hand, and went inside to start the bread. The grasshoppers came at the end of June. They did not arrive the way trouble sometimes arrives on the frontier, with warning, with a slow gathering of clouds or a shift in wind that gives a person time to brace. They came the way a rumor becomes a fact, overnight, without ceremony, and all at once. The wife stepped out at first light and heard them before she saw them. A low, papery sound, almost like distant rain, but moving wrong, too close to the ground, too horizontal, too alive. She stood in the cabin doorway for a moment with her shawl pulled tight, listening. Then she walked to the garden. What she found there she would carry in her memory for the rest of her life, not with dread, but with the particular clarity of a morning when everything becomes suddenly important. Her bed stood. The cabbage heads, broader now, cupped inward the way good cabbages do. The pumpkin vines had begun their slow, confident sprawl across the soil. The tomato stems held their posture. The carrot tops, feathery and bright, swayed slightly in the early air. Around the edges of the garden, at the borders where her beds met the open prairie grass, she could see the insects moving in their restless, indifferent way. But inside the rows, inside the ground that had been worked and scratched and amended by 40 pairs of small feet every morning for 2 months, there was something different. A stillness, as though the soil itself had grown inhospitable to careless visitors. The neighbors were not so fortunate. By the second morning, word had moved through Millhaven the way word always moves in small places, quietly, person to person, in the particular tone people use when something bad has happened to someone else, and they have not yet decided how to feel about it. One family had lost most of their bean rows. Another had watched their corn silk stripped back in a single night. A third had found their squash leaves lace-wrought and useless by dawn. She saw them come to look. They did not come openly. They drifted past on the road, or appeared at the edge of the fence line, or found small reasons to be moving in the direction of her garden at the hour when she walked the chicks through the rows. They were not smiling now. The fold of their mouths was different, not hard, not unkind, but changed. She recognized the expression. It was the face of people reconsidering something they had already decided. She did not stop her work. She moved the birds through the beds the same as she had every morning, speaking to them in the low, unhurried voice she had developed over weeks of this practice. She counted them. She watched them work. Her husband, walking the rows in the evening, said nothing to the neighbors and nothing about them. He only knelt once beside a pumpkin vine and pressed 2 fingers lightly against the soil to measure its moisture, then stood and brushed his hands on his trousers, satisfied. The chicks moved between the rows like small, purposeful things that had always belonged there. The pumpkin vines had begun to sprawl in the second week of July, reaching past the boundaries she had set for them in her mind, thickening at the joints until the stems were nearly as wide as her thumb. She rose before the heat settled and walked out into the blue-gray of early morning with a bundle of cut stakes under her arm, her boots already darkening at the toe from the dew in the grass. Her husband was already there. He had risen before her, which was not unusual now. They had both become people who woke with the light, or just ahead of it, as though the farm had quietly adjusted their sleeping to its own schedule. They worked without speaking for a time, moving down the vine rows together, pressing stakes into the soil and looping twine in loose figures to guide the heaviest growth upward and away from the ground. The pumpkins themselves were already remarkable, round and dense, with a color deepening toward the warm gold of late afternoon, even at this early hour. She pressed her palm against the side of one and felt its firmness, its particular resistance, and thought of her father, who had once told her that a healthy vegetable had its own kind of confidence. She said this out loud. Her husband looked up from where he knelt at a vine junction, a length of twine held between his teeth. He took it out. He considered what she had said. He believed that, the husband said. It was not a question. He believed most things were easier to help than to fight, she said. The pests, the weeds, the birds. He used to say that the soil already knew what it wanted to do, that our part was mostly to listen. The husband was quiet for a moment, working the twine around a stake. Then he said, "There were mornings I thought we were wrong, that we had misread the pamphlet or that what worked somewhere else would fail here." He paused. That we had staked everything on a dead man's notes and our own stubbornness. She looked at him. He was not ashamed to have said it. That was one of the things she valued most in him. He did not dress his doubts in better clothing. "I was afraid too," she said. "In May, when Mr. Fettle asked me point blank if I expected to see a single surviving seedling by June, I told him yes with a certainty I didn't fully feel." The husband almost smiled. "You sounded certain." "I was practicing," she said. They moved to the cabbage beds then, where the heads had grown heavy enough to list slightly to one side, and she began the careful work of tying the outer leaves up and in, the way her father's notes had described, to protect the developing hearts from too much direct sun. Her husband held each head gently while she tied, which was the kind of labor that looked like nothing and was actually everything. The chicks were beginning to stir in their temporary enclosure at the garden's edge, calling out in small, insistent voices that the morning was wasting. The word reached them the way most words did in Millhaven, sideways, through a third party who hadn't intended to carry it. It was the wife of the man who ran the dry goods counter, a spare, careful woman who bore no particular ill will toward anyone, who mentioned it to the wife while she was purchasing a spool of thread in the second week of July. She said it plainly, the way a person delivers unpleasant information when they believe you deserve to know it rather than be spared it. One of the neighboring homesteaders, the one whose fence line ran along the southern edge of their claim, the one who had lost nearly his entire cabbage planting to the grasshopper surge, had told Mr. Cord Fettle directly in the feed store, in front of at least 4 other men, that whatever the Cincinnati couple had growing on their quarter section had nothing to do with any method. It was the soil. Some patches of Nebraska prairie simply ran richer than others. Any farmer knew that. They had been lucky, and that was the whole of it. The wife thanked the woman for the thread and walked home. She told her husband that evening, while they were washing the day's dirt from their hands at the basin near the door. He listened without interrupting, which was his way. When she finished, he dried his hands and looked out toward the garden, where the last of the July light was settling across the pumpkin vines in long, amber bars. "Does it trouble you?" he asked. She considered it honestly. "A little," she said. "Not the accusation itself. The ease of it. How quickly a man can decide that what he doesn't understand must be luck." He nodded slowly. She crossed to the table where the satchel sat, as it always did in the same corner. She did not open it. She rested her hand on the worn leather for a moment. Her father's initials pressed faintly into the flap, nearly gone now from years of handling. And then she simply closed the clasp that had already been closed. "October will answer it better than either of us can," she said. There was nothing theatrical in how she said it. It was not a declaration. It was closer to the way a person states a fact they have already made their peace with, quietly, without needing anyone else to agree. Her husband looked at her. "Your father would have liked this place," he said, which was not a response to what she had said and yet was exactly the right thing. She almost laughed. "He would have been out in those rows at first light with a magnifying glass and a notebook. So would you. So would I," she agreed. Outside, the pumpkin vines continued their slow, unhurried work beneath the last of the evening light, indifferent to what was being said about them in town. The first frost came on a Wednesday. It arrived the way such things do on the Nebraska prairie. Not announced, not dramatic, simply present at dawn, silvering the garden rose with a quiet authority that made argument seem beside the point. She saw it from the cabin window before he was fully awake, and she stood there in the gray, early light, watching the pumpkin leaves hold their frosted edges while the sky behind them went slowly from charcoal to a pale, washed copper. By the time he came to stand beside her, she already had her coat on. They worked without haste, but they worked steadily. The frost had not damaged what lay beneath. The soil held warmth enough, and the skins of the pumpkins were thick and well set, the cabbages dense to the core. He knelt at the first pumpkin and worked his hands beneath it, the way he had learned by midsummer, cradling rather than gripping, letting the weight distribute. When he lifted it fully and carried it to the wagon, she noted how he walked, carefully, without rushing, as though the thing in his arms had earned a certain respect and he intended to show it. It was not a small pumpkin. She pulled cabbages while he went back for another, and she did not speak because there was nothing that needed saying. The cabbages came free of the ground, with a sound that felt final and right, a clean release, the roots giving up their hold after a long season of holding. She laid each one on the wagon bed beside the first pumpkin, and the weight of it shifted the whole wagon slightly, and that small shift seemed to her the most satisfying thing she had experienced in months. The carrots came last, long-rooted and firm, some of them running deeper than her forearm from elbow to wrist. She pulled each one slowly, not wanting to snap them, and she lined them along the wagon bed in rows, the way her father had once lined his seed packets across his work table. Not for show, but because order had always seemed to her a form of gratitude. By late morning, the wagon was loaded, and they stood at its side together and looked at what the season had made of their faith. The pumpkins sat in the October light like something out of a county fair story told to children. The cabbages were vast and pale green, dense as stone. The carrots lay in their neat rows, improbable and golden. He reached for her hand. He did not say anything. He held it the way a person holds something they are in no hurry to put down. Firmly, quietly, with no particular purpose beyond the holding itself. She let the silence last a full minute, maybe longer. Then she said, "We should go before the light changes." He helped her up to the wagon seat, and they drove toward Millhaven together. The trestle table had been set up along the south wall of the Millhaven Grange Hall, long enough to seat 12, but dressed that afternoon for display rather than dining. Someone had laid a length of burlap across its surface, and by the time they carried in the last of the pumpkins, a small crowd had already gathered, not the polite, curious kind, but the kind that goes quiet in the presence of something it cannot easily explain. The pumpkins sat at one end, 4 of them, the largest tipping the scale the Grange keeper used to weigh grain sacks at just under 42 pounds. The cabbages were arranged beside them, their outer leaves still intact, wide and pale and dense as river stone. The carrots lay in their rows as she had laid them in the wagon, not for show, but because order had always seemed to her a form of gratitude. Mr. Cordfettle came and stood at the table for a long time without speaking. He had sold them the 40 chicks in April with a patient smile that said he expected to hear no more of it. He looked at the carrots. He looked at the pumpkins. He said nothing for a while. Then he removed his hat. He was not the only one. The neighbors came in ones and twos, the same families who had watched from fence lines in May with folded arms and cautious predictions. They came and they looked, and then they asked their questions, not loudly, not with the comfortable confidence they had carried through the summer. They asked the way people ask when they already understand that they were wrong and would prefer to learn something useful from the fact. She had brought the satchel. She set it on the table beside the carrots and unbuckled it the way she always did. 2 buckles, left before right, the leather worn smooth at the edges from her father's years of use. She found the pamphlet near the bottom, as she always did, its pages soft as cloth from handling. She laid it open on the burlap. She did not make a speech. She smoothed the pages flat with the back of her hand and stepped aside so that whoever wished to read could read. He answered the questions that followed, quietly, plainly, the same way he had done most things since April. He explained the method in the only terms it required. The chicks ate what would have eaten the garden, turned the soil with their small feet, left behind what the soil needed. His wife, he said, had found the practice in those pages, and they had trusted it together when trusting it had not been easy. The committee offer came before the hall had emptied. They accepted it, not with ceremony, but with the steadiness of people who had already decided, some months before, to belong. The walk home was short. The ground was bare and harvested and entirely theirs. She took his hand before he offered it.